Hi, everybody. Welcome to the March edition of the SVC Monthly Speaker Series. Our speaker today, Kevin Barresi, holds a very, very warm place in my heart. Kevin was among the very first members of the SVC when we opened in the middle of 2016. He was the founder of a company called Iable Inc., which he began working on when he was a sophomore. And he was among the hardest working people I've ever met. He was always at the Venture Center, day and night. And on the day that Kevin graduated from Stevens with a joint bachelor's and master's degree in computer engineering, he was named CTO, Chief Technology Officer, and co-founder of FinTech Studios, which had acquired Iable, his company, on the day he graduated. At FinTech Studios, Kevin's helped build the company from an idea to a successful business rooted in a high-performance, secure, and efficient technology and product infrastructure. Kevin is recognized for his innovative work in technology and holds several awards, including an Edison Patent Award for his contributions to data analytics and data visualization. He's here today to share with us his really inspirational story of how you can build a really successful company while you're still studying for a joint degree at Stevens. Please join me in welcoming Kevin back to Stevens.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Well, great. So thanks everyone for coming. Like Adrian mentioned, my name's Kevin Barresi. Graduated Stevens back in 2016.
2016.
Yeah, I need to be reminded sometimes. And yeah, so what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about sort of my story of how I started Iable back in the day with really an idea of web browsing. Ultimately built that as a company, raised some money, and then partnered with a company called FinTech Studios, and ultimately that company acquired Iable, and as part of that transaction I joined on as the CTO. And so I'll also tell a little bit about FinTech Studios and what we're doing now and sort of what we do. So if anyone's graduating soon and wants to work in programming with JavaScript, let me know because we are hiring. So I'll sort of start by going through these different things, but what I want to do is, while I'm going through a little bit of my story, I want to point out some things that I identified as potential takeaways. So things that, as you're going through this, you realize, I wish I had known this when I started. Some of them are obvious, some of them maybe not so obvious, but if I can at least help anyone that's even thinking about it save a little bit of time or energy or effort, then it's probably worth it. So just a little bit high level about myself. I went to Stevens, obviously. I'm actually from New Jersey, from Monmouth County, if anyone knows the area. So I didn't go too far. But basically, when I started Stevens, and even before Stevens, I was just really big into building things. Whether it was playing around with circuits or like building Linux on my really old laptop, or really just driving my parents insane. I think one of their least favorite projects of mine was when I built like a little taser out of disposable flash cameras, and my poor sister was the unwilling test subject for that. So I never hear the end of that. But really projects like that you sort of really enjoy, and in doing so you learn along the way. So that's sort of really what I enjoyed doing. And ultimately I took that, and when I came to Stevens for computer engineering, I really continued with that. So while I was at Stevens, obviously doing all these different courseworks for computer engineering, which is your basic engineering spine, I'm sure you guys have had to go through a bunch of those. When I was a sophomore, I started working with one of the professors here, and ultimately, after spending some time, we ended up thinking of a couple ideas that we really wanted to start building stuff around. And ultimately, that was the formation of Iable. Iable, I spent a lot of time on while I was here, building the product, raising capital, going to end users, getting feedback, and then redoing that a bunch of times. Ultimately, as part of that, I met a guy named Jim Touziant, who's the CEO of FinTech Studios, and we worked together for about a year or so, and in doing so, ultimately decided that the two companies were much better together than separate. So that's how I ended up joining FinTech Studios, where I continue today. So FinTech Studios, for anyone that doesn't know, is a company focused around fintech. That's the name, which is really the application of technology into financial services. So you always see on your bank websites or all the bank stuff that they're very, very old and antiquated. Really a side effect of the fact that they're a very heavily regulated industry. However, that's sort of been an excuse to stay 10 years behind in the technology stack. I mean, I'm sure there's still computers inside these firms that are running Windows XP, which is really scary. But ultimately, we're sort of that latest movement of trying to bring technology and bring these different financial firms, whether it's banks, brokers, and so forth, into the 21st century in terms of their technology. So it's a really interesting area. And going into this, I had no idea about finance and any of that stuff, so it was a little bit of a crash course. But regardless, pretty fun journey. So you guys might recognize this guy if you're familiar with the Stevens Venture Center. His name's Mukunda Yengar. Really, he was one of the early enablers for me for how to start going about this and really help nurture the idea that I could go out there, I could build stuff, and just try and see what happens. So back when I was a freshman, actually, I had him for data structures, and so I was in data structures with him, and it's again C++, learning different things, and essentially I would finish stuff and just sort of goof off in class and do my own side projects. One of them was an app called Penguin Panic I made. Not great at branding, clearly. I learned how to use Photoshop somewhat, but essentially it was an Android app that was a little game that you played. Not super fun. But ultimately, I took this to Mukund and was like, hey, look, this cool thing I got. Isn't this nifty? And I'll get into that in a little bit. But other than that, I had a bunch of projects at Stevens, like a dorm room RFID reader, where I essentially put an RFID reader on the inside of the door, hooked it up to a servo for the lock, and if you had the RFID card and pushed it right on the peephole, it would open it, and other miscellaneous projects like that. So I was always really trying to just build stuff and don't tell anyone, but not focus on schoolwork. But ultimately, after meeting Mukund and talking with him a few times, I think we both sort of realized a little bit about each other, which was the fact that we really just liked building things and just building things to see what happens. And so that's how I met him, and ultimately that leads to takeaway number one, which I think is probably one of the most important ones, actually, which is finding something you're passionate about and really running with it. So for me, it was just miscellaneous projects, right? I just really loved building things. I loved programming things. I loved the concept of being able to just sit at a computer and type a bunch of things, and suddenly something was produced from that. And so the reason why I say this, and the idea of having all these side projects, of why that's really important, is because really two things. One is that you're going to find out if you really enjoy this area. So for me, it was, do I really enjoy programming? Do I really enjoy electronics and so forth? Because as you're doing it, you're going to see really quick if it's actually something you like. Because if you don't like it, you're not going to stick with it. But then also, you're going to find out and learn more than really any class can teach you, because that's really the whole concept of practice versus theoretical, right? I mean, you can learn as much as you want in a classroom about how something should work theoretically on paper, but the second you take any system and introduce it into a real-world environment, it's going to not work the way you expect it to. And so by having these different projects and these different things that you just sort of learn yourself on, whether it's going to Stack Overflow or whatever, and trying to figure out and really slog through it yourself, this really teaches you all the different things that you need to be aware of, and just really gives you a better understanding of how to actually apply this than a typical class might from a practicality standpoint. So from there, after working with Mukund for a bit, he actually introduced me to a guy named Cam Hill, all the way back in the day. I think right now he's at UCLA getting his PhD, so he took the academic route. But ultimately, when we all three of us sat down and were thinking about different things of different problems we had, right? We thought, when we're browsing the web, there's a lot of blank space on the web pages. When you look at Wikipedia, on the side margins, there's always just a ton of blank space. So ultimately, that boiled down to, is there a better way to display web pages? And we weren't sure, so we started thinking about it. And then ultimately, that sort of leads to how we came up with an idea, right? So we identified the problem. In this case, that problem was changed from there's a lot of blank space on web pages to it evolved to, sort of related, I have 30 tabs open on my browser. Why do I need this? This is really not easy to use. It's really easy to get lost. And then we'd talk to people and they'd say, well, I have not only one browser window open with 30 tabs, but I have 5 open with 30 tabs. And so it suddenly becomes a really not great way to go about this. And from there, that was really the approach we took, which was finding that initial issue and that initial pain point and thinking, okay, now that we know what the problem is, how do we actually go about solving this? And that's an iterative process, right? You're not going to figure that out day one. You're not going to look at a problem and say, well, clearly the answer is X, Y, Z, because chances are people have probably looked at that before and all the obvious ideas either don't work or have been done before. And so after iterating on this a bunch of times, whether we needed to visualize the different web pages in a different way, or whether we needed to create like a website to show this for you and manage your tabs and manage your bookmarks, ultimately after going through this a bunch of times, we realized, is the answer another web app, or is it actually creating a new browser, really taking a step back and transforming the way you browse the internet? And ultimately that is what we realized is the issue. It's that when you look over the history of web browsers, right, it started in the early 90s with things like Opera and things along those lines. But really the latest big innovation in web browsing from a user perspective was tabs. And that was actually released in 2000, 2001. So if you think about it, the concept of browser features and browser UI and user interfaces hasn't really changed in almost 20 years. And if I ask anyone, the internet itself has certainly changed in 20 years, whether it's the content on there, whether it's the speed, whether it's the amount you use it, or how you use it, interface needs to go along with functionality. So for us, that was where we said, I think we might be onto something here. And that is really what leads me to the second takeaway, which is solving a problem you're familiar with and finding a pain that's big enough that people actually want to use it, or in some cases pay for it. Which is really the idea of making sure that you're familiar with it. Obviously, I'm a person, I browse the internet, so I was acutely aware of the issues associated with this. But then the second piece of that is identifying problems and pains that are significant, right? You don't want to solve a problem that someone says, oh yeah, that's nice. Yeah, that would certainly make my life easier. But are you actually gonna, is it valuable enough, and does it solve painful enough problem that you would be willing to give value to it? And whether that value is money, or whether that value is attention, or whether that value is giving you their personal data, there's a lot of different ways you can extract value from people, and that's something you gotta think about. Because when you take the transition from an idea to a business, those are vastly different things, right? So having an idea is great, and having a side project is great, and they're a lot of fun, and I totally recommend doing that. But you need to make sure that you don't confuse an idea or a hobby project with a viable business, because ultimately the goal is a business is self-sufficient, it makes money, whether it's through subscriptions to the product itself, or whether it's through the mind share you have of the users that you somehow monetize. But at the end of the day, if your goal is to create a business around something, you have to have something that is valuable enough that people are willing to give you value to it. And the second sort of aspect of that is the familiarity aspect. So say you have a great idea, but you have no idea about the field it's in, right? Well, that's a big problem, because if you don't have familiarity with the field you're thinking about or thinking about getting into business in, you're going to run into a lot more problems that if you knew the field well, you'd be able to immediately pick up on and say, okay, I'm off here. And really that comes to the idea of time saving, because ultimately, yeah, if you're not familiar with an industry or a topic, you can figure your way out and become an expert in it as part of that process. But you're going to save a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of pain by at least being familiar with it, or knowing somebody that is an expert. Again, at the end of the day, you don't know everything, you're not expected to, but if you can at least find people that are experts in the field, you can leverage them. Whether it's a friend or a colleague or just someone you happen to meet, a professor, you can pick their brains as much as you want, and that's really important because it's leveraging your network, right? So once you have sort of this base concept of what you think your idea is, right, or what you think could ultimately be transformed into a business, from my experience, it was very, very important to start building quickly, because in building quickly and getting something out in front of the users, you're going to very, very quickly know whether you're at least on the right path or totally off. Initial users that are really interested in technology or newer things are going to be pretty forgiving in terms of bugs or lack of functionality, but through that experience and through talking to end users and actually getting their feedback and chatting with them and providing sort of an updated roadmap of what you plan on releasing and taking their feedback and incorporating it into the product, you're going to get a really good feel for the value of the different things you're building, which is really important, because if you can validate that yes, this is a painful issue that people have, and I might have found the solution for it, then that's extremely important. Because even if you can at least confirm that, yes, there is an issue there that's painful, and maybe my solution right now is not the answer to that, that again is still valuable, because at least you identified an opportunity. And then you can iterate on that and figure out, okay, well, if my current thought process of how to fix this doesn't actually work, then you can think about, okay, what do I need to change and what do I need to modify to get this to work? And so from the iUbble side of things, that really started with just me, because at this point, Cameron had already left. We had done some research over a summer, so it was just me and Mukund working on this. And so really the roles were, I would be all on the technology side, and Mukund would sort of noodle around and think, oh, what if we did X, Y, Z, or let me take this to my students and get their feedback. So that was really great. I mean, it was really useful to be able to get Mukund to sit down a group of 30 people in his class and force them to test something. So things like that, really just getting that user feedback. But as I was going about building this, again, it was a process, right? I mean, it was a pretty big undertaking building a new web browser. You can't really train for that. So really for me, my approach was, again, just start building. I looked at a couple of the tools out there. I knew for a web browser it had to be decently low level. I was already familiar with C++, so we started writing some browser code in C++. The goal being that I wouldn't write my own rendering engine, which is sort of the actual really, really difficult part behind a web browser, but rather take an existing open source web engine like Chromium or one of those and wrap it. And essentially by providing that, we'd be able to quickly provide value on the front end, which is how do you interact with the web without having to spend the time and effort to build the underlying systems. And so that's another really important thing, which is you don't have to build everything, and you shouldn't build everything. Rather, you should focus on what you're good at and build around that, because that's really where your value is. I mean, if you go out and build a new web rendering engine but don't have the interface to wrap it, is that valuable? Probably not, because Google's not going to use it. They have their own. Microsoft's not going to use it because they're going to be using Google's. And Firefox is not going to use it because they have their own. So without that sort of full system that you can then take that as value to the end user, just building technology for technology's sake isn't going to help you. And so after doing this for a while, probably about a year and a half of just building the product and iterating on it and getting user feedback, these focus groups of saying, here's the product, sitting them down, saying, okay, here's how you install it, everyone install it, now browse. And I would walk around, look over their shoulders, answer any questions. After doing this and then taking that response back and going back and editing it and updating it, sitting back down again with the users, getting their feedback again. So you see this cycle here. After doing this for a while, that's when we started realizing, okay, when do we actually bring the whole company piece into this? Because at this point, there was no company. There was simply me and Mukund sitting around thinking, oh, what if we did this? And then me going, yeah, let me code that. Sounds great. So then the question is, when do you start a company and why do you start a company? Because when you have the overhead of an actual corporate entity, because once you start stepping into legal land, it's not fun. But then the question is, what kind of overhead does this bring? Because there is significant overhead that just having that corporate entity brings. You have to file taxes. You have to file different things quarterly. You have to build your incorporation documents. You need to build write your articles of incorporation, your bylaws. So there's just a lot of stuff that would essentially take away from your time of actually building a product. Because starting a company brings no value, but building a good product does. So it's important that you really focus your time on the things that bring value, which is building the product. So then the question is, with all this in mind, when do you actually pull the trigger and say, okay, it's time to start a company? And that really boils down to when you need to protect yourself legally. And note there's a disclaimer here that I'm not a lawyer, because I am not, and I don't pretend to be. So take it all with a grain of salt. This is all just my personal thoughts and from my experience. But for me, it was really when you need to protect yourself legally. Because the entire point of a company is that the company becomes an entity or a person, basically, in the sense that the company thing can hold liability. If you sue Google, you're not suing the CEO of Google, you're suing Google, the company. So the people working for the companies, in this case, Mukund and myself, are protected from a liability perspective, which is extremely important because as you build things, the last thing you want to do is have legal exposure. So say, you're building a product and you're storing all this personally identifiable information and suddenly it gets hacked. Well, people aren't going to be happy, and potentially, I'm not saying there could be lawsuits. If you have not incorporated and don't have a legal entity protecting you, then you personally become liable, which nobody wants because that means they can go after your bank account. However, if you have a company protecting you, they sue the company, and if they win, then, oh no, the company's out of business, but you're still safe. So things like that, and there's different reasons why you want to incorporate. So for example, raising capital. If you are raising capital, you need to sell off part of your company. Well, you need to have a company to sell off to get that capital. Another reason to incorporate. Another reason is if you're getting revenue, because again, once you start getting revenue, it has to be attributed to somebody. So either you're booking the revenue as your own income, in which case you're taxed, or you're booking the revenue for a company, in which case the company is taxed. And there's different tax systems. I'm not an accountant. I don't want to be an accountant. But there's different reasons why you'd want to do that. And really, at the end of the day, it's anything where if you get in trouble for, quote, messing up, you need to protect yourself for this. And so that's sort of the third takeaway, which is figuring out when you want to start a company and not doing it prematurely. Because if you just start a company when you're still in the idea phase, you've wasted your time. And the likelihood is when you figure out, oh, there's really no idea to be had, now you're stuck with having to unwind that company and deal with all the paperwork, which is not fun. So it's really just a waste of time if you do this too early. If you are going to start a company, and again, this is just typically what I've heard from different lawyers and different people out there and from different venture capitalists who invest in these companies, it's best, and it's really sort of standard operating procedure, to incorporate as either a Delaware C corporation, which is a type of company, or a Delaware LLC. And the cool thing is you actually don't have to be in Delaware to incorporate as a Delaware company. Makes no sense, but the reason why you do this is because apparently Delaware has really great court systems that are biased a little bit more towards the businesses, and it also has really good corporate tax laws. So wherever you decide to incorporate, it's not a huge deal, but typically this is what's standard. And one of the stories that I always like to tell when you start your first company, specifically as a Delaware C Corp, which is what iAble was, is the first tax bill you're going to get. So when I had incorporated, ran through it full year, sent out my tax stuff in April or whatever, and I get my first tax bill for iAble, the company, and I'm looking at that, I'm saying, okay, let me just put down my revenue 0, 0, 0 across the board. I'm expecting no tax. This is gonna be great. Lo and behold, I get a tax bill for $110,000. And I'm looking at this just like, all right, well, game over. That was fun. And it really comes down to when you file for your taxes the first time, you have to elect to do special treatment of how you treat your value and your shares, in which case it came down after some back and forth to like $70. But I always think that's a really funny sort of story that I think a lot of people when they start their first company go through, because it scares you really bad. So if you see that, don't get too worried. So like I mentioned, for us really the reason to incorporate was to raise capital. And the question is, why raise capital? Well, what is capital, right? So capital is when you sell off a part of your company or percentage, which is measured in shares. So the way a company works is you have your company, and what you do is you issue shares of the company, which are essentially fractions of the company. And there's different classes of that, all which have different priorities. So preferred shares are obviously preferred over common shares. And the reason why you have these different stages is because when you have what's called a liquidation event, or you get bought, or you go into bankruptcy, or you IPO or whatever, the different classes of outstanding shares and debt you have determines what order that's liquidated in. So for example, if you sell preferred shares to a venture capital and you as the founder have a bunch of common shares and you go into bankruptcy, or an IPO, probably a little bit happier to say. But either way, you're having some type of liquidation or sale. What's going to happen is there's an order that people go through and say, okay, let's first satisfy all the preferred common shares. And it's going to run through all your assets and sell those off and say, okay, they got their money back, they're done. Then it's going to run through and say, okay, what do we have left of assets to sell? And it's going to run through the common shares, and you might not get all the way through. So that's why you have these different classes of shares and so forth. So not super important, but it's fun to know. So again, why raise the capital? It's to sell off equity in your company, so that way people have an ownership stake in your company in exchange for money or services, typically money. And the way this works is you typically have what's called different fundraising rounds. It's It's really just what groups of investors you want to bring in at a certain time. So you might have a seed round or an angels round first, in which case you just get friends and family or angel investors, which are generally individual wealthy people, to say, yeah, I like you, I'll throw in 25K. And you're like, oh, thanks. The next step after that is typically like a seed round, where you actually might get institutional investors, which are more your professional venture capitalist or strategic investor or large angels. The next step after that is your traditional Series A, which is much more focused on either the very large angels or VCs or strategic investors. And then Series B, Series C, Series D. It really goes on for as long as you want. There's really no importance in the name of it. It just sort of delineates, we're raising money at this valuation, who wants in? But ultimately, that's how it works. And so back again to the original question of why do you need to raise capital? It's because you need money for things. So whether you need office space. Back when I was with iUbble, we did not have the venture center, so I actually had to rent office space in a co-working space at Mission 50 over in Southwest Hoboken. So for us, that was expensive. It was something like $500, $600 a month per person. So when I had that plus 3 co-ops working for the company, that adds up very quickly. So it was maybe $2,500 or no, $3 or $4 grand a month of just that. So you need money to support that. Which goes to the second item, which is if you need help. So if you need interns or co-ops or employees, you need to be able to pay them, assuming they're not getting equity in the company. If you think you have a really good idea, the most valuable thing you own is the equity in the company. And so you don't want to just go throwing shares saying, you get some shares and you get some shares, everyone gets shares. No, it's much cheaper long-term to give them cash. So typically if you can give them cash, give them cash. And then finally, if you need supplies, whether it's a software license, I know for myself, I use my student discount and student ID to get a lot of free software for a long time. Ultimately, that runs out after some time, or different supplies and things like that. And again, the who, when you're first starting off, it's really friends, family, angel investors, people you know. At that point, they're not so much investing in the actual company. They're investing either in you, pretty much, that you can execute on an idea. And the important thing is they shouldn't be expecting to make any money back on this because the likelihood is quite low. So in this case, what you do is after you've incorporated, you draw up the share purchase agreements or whatever. You can get a cheap lawyer to look through them. I know there are some offered through the Venture Center that do some of that stuff. So you can have them look at it. There's a bunch of sort of pre-made forms online that say how to do this. And ultimately, you get them to sign the form that says, yes, I'm giving you X thousands of dollars for Y shares in the company. And then they hand you a check and you say, thanks. That's pretty much it. You need to make sure you track this. It's what's called a cap table. So you need to make sure you track who owns what in the company. So don't lose track of that. That's bad. Which leads me to takeaway 4. The question is always, well, how much money should I raise? I should raise a lot of money, right? No, the answer is not raise as much money as you can. It's raise as much as you need, because every time you raise money, every time you sell off part of your company, you're giving away shares, which, like I mentioned before, is one of the most valuable things in your company. It also means that you, as one of the founders of your company, your ownership percentage goes down and down and down and down. So for your benefit, you want to raise as little money as possible, enough to execute what you need to get to the next step, and maybe enough to give you some wiggle room. But you don't want to say, I have a good idea and we're valued at $100,000 right now, and I'm going to raise $75,000 because congrats, you just sold pretty much your company, which you probably don't want to do at that stage. So you need to think in your head how much you want to raise for your valuation. And it's always a battle, because the VCs or the investors you're talking to, assuming they're not friends and family, they're going to try to say, oh, you're not worth that much, you're not worth that much, so they can get more percentage. So it's important that you understand what they're looking for and what you're looking for. That's a little bit easier to do when you're still in the friends and family round, because it's literally saying, hey uncle, or hey friends, can you give me some money? Yeah, sure. So they're pretty versatile there, but make sure you don't raise more than what you need, because ultimately that's going to shoot yourself in the foot when you actually do bring in some of the more professional VCs that are going to look and say, okay, so you're valuing yourself at $50 million in your friends and family round? Oh, that's funny, because we think you're only worth like 50K. So in that case, you just really screwed your previous investors, which you don't want to do. So again, think about it, be careful with it, don't raise more than you need. Second part is, just because you get money does not mean you should spend it very quickly. you should conserve that money as much as possible. And you should conserve the money in a way that as you're spending it, it's not forming a baseline requirement to keep the business alive. So say, for example, if you need money because you need to hire interns to help you program, right? Fine. You're going to pay them however much an hour, and then as you burn through that money, worst case scenario, you don't make enough money, and you think, oh, I need to raise some more capital to continue hiring, having these 5 people work for me. Worst case scenario with that type of burn rate, if you need to, you can just say, sorry guys, I don't need you working for me anymore, in which case your burn rate, which is how much money you're going through per month or per year, drops down to 0, and in that case, you're fine because you're not burning cash, but you're not making cash. However, if you sign a 2-year or 3-year AWS agreement with Amazon Web Services that says, I'm going to pay you $1,000 a month for the next 3 years because that's going to get me a nice discount, and I expect I'll have the money by then, not a problem. And suddenly 12 months in, you realize, I have $500 left. Well, that's not something you can just say, oh, I'm going to turn it off, because you already agreed to it. So in that case, you're in big trouble, because you either need to say, I can't pay this anymore, time to go bankrupt, time to liquidate the company, or you are forced to raise more capital, which is never a situation you want to be in. If you're in the situation where you have to go to someone and say, hey, I'm going to be out of business in a month if you don't give me this money, who has the leverage there? And they're going to play some fun games with the valuations if you're in the situation. So moral of the story, be very, very conservative with your cash spend once you get it. And don't put yourself in a situation where if you aren't hitting your sales goals or your growth goals, that you're setting yourself up for failure. So when we raised capital, it was because needed some help on it. So we hired 3 co-ops, and also because we needed the associated office space with that. So throughout it, I ended up raising $37,000 of capital for this, friends and family. So I went through and basically had some friends' parents that said, yeah, we'll get together and throw a couple thousand at this, or a couple other people would put a couple thousand at a time, and so forth to get money in here. One of them was actually an intern I had, basically saying, I'm giving you this to pay for my nephew's summer job, so if I can get some equity out of it, cool. And I'm like, all right, awesome, I'll make sure to use that. So again, friends and family, at this point, they're investing in you, not the company, so just keep that in mind. After we raised some money, we continued doing what we were doing, obviously, which was building the product out. And after a while, we actually ran into a company called FinTech Studios through Stevens. So it was back when Werner Core was working here still. He met with Jim Tuzian, who's the CEO of FinTech Studios, and said, oh, we have this interesting thing that one of our students is working on. It's a new web browser. And FinTech Studios, being a financial technology company, the first reaction was, that's not really in our wheelhouse, but hey, we'll take a look anyway. And so ultimately we started talking to each other, and what we did was I issued them, one of the points that they had was, look, when you're going towards consumer sales, meaning you're trying to sell to an actual end person, not a business, that's tough because you have to sell each person one by one by one, rather than selling in bulk. And end consumers are typically a lot more unwilling to spend money for things like a web browser or websites. So it's a lot tougher to sort of get that consumer business down. So from his point of view, his background was always in enterprise B2B sales, which is really focusing on financial services. But at the end of the day, it's all the same, right? You're selling to a company, the company itself buys a bulk of it, and you're done. So you can easily get chunks of 500 users or 1,000 users or 2,000 users in one sales effort. So their idea was, okay, well, what we do is we like to sell different products to financial services firms. And back then they were more of like a product aggregator, I'd say is the best way to say it. So they partnered with a bunch of different companies and provided sales services where they would take all these different products and say, oh, well, we have a CRM here, and we have equity analytics here, and we have a social media compliance tool here. What if we package this together and said, we can sell this as a sort of aggregate, which was great. And so the issue they ran into was, how do you start packaging all these things together if you have no framework to do it? And so what they thought was, well, a web browser is basically a container, right? So you can stick all these different applications inside this container, and suddenly you have your way to ship this. So you can say, oh, you have your CRM tab and you have your analytics tab and you have all these other things, again, bundled under the common deployment of a browser. And so that's really where they saw the value in what we were doing at iUble. And so officially the goal was that they would join on with a reseller agreement where they had the license and ability to resell our product to whoever they wanted, and essentially with a rev share. So they would sell it and we get 50% of that sale and they get 50% of that sale. From my perspective, I was like, oh, awesome, easy enough. You sell it, you spend your sales resources doing this, and I just sort of sit back and take some revenue from this on a market that I wasn't typically focusing in on. Perfect. And so that's really how this relationship with FinTech Studios began, which is sort of leading to my next takeaway, which is knowing what you're good at and what you're not good at. So they came at it from having a lot of experience in financial services and enterprise B2B sales. The founder of this company was one of the founders of a company called Multex back in the 90s. He took that company public, brought it to $1.5 billion market cap, sold it to Thomson Reuters, and has done this for a few other companies. So you have that expertise there, and you gained this over the years. I was not good at that, and I knew I wasn't good at sales and marketing, especially in an enterprise environment where really the important part is that you know people, you know companies, and you know who to sell to. So that was something where I realized there's no way I'm going to be able to sort of break into this market. It makes sense to partner for this. And that really comes back to the whole concept of, you hear this a lot, which is, do you build or do you partner or acquire, right? Build versus buy. And that can be applied to a lot of different things. In this case, it was applied to a service, sales and marketing in a specific industry. It could be applied to technology. So one of the things that we were thinking about at FinTech Studios was, or other companies was, if you're building a platform and you need content in it, and there's 30 companies that specialize in content, but your specialty is the analytics on the content, do you bother trying to replicate what all these 30 companies have done, even though it's not really in your sweet spot? Probably no. The answer should be you either partner with them for the content or you buy the content from them. Because essentially, if you don't, what you're doing is you're splitting your effort on the things that you're good at and the things that you bring value with into something that's either commoditized or really will take a lot of time from it. So it really comes down to time savings and effort savings and focusing on, again, the things that you as a company are really good at and really bring value in. So this partnership with FinTech Studios really brought around this concept of sort of co-developing a slight version of the iUble web browser, one that was really focused on Wall Street and financial services, because as our core product, we had this generic consumer web browser. It worked, it was cool, we had people using it, but for financial services, you had to have something a little bit different for those guys. And so that's what we started building with sort of their guidance and sort of our technology and our product. We had sort of two products at that point. One was the financial services one, and then the generic web browser. This was actually one of the slides from when we were going out and talking to different people and selling this back when I didn't really know what a broker was. So I said buy-side brokers and sell-side brokers. Actually makes no sense. But like I said, crash course in financial services. But ultimately, this was sort of what we were going around doing, trying to see if this idea stuck, which was, we have the core concept that the iUble web browser had, which was discover, organize, and share. So you want to discover new content, you want to organize your existing content, and you want to be able to share that easily with counterparties. But then taking that concept and applying that to this new vertical. You want to be able to identify and discover all this interesting content when you're on the street. You want to be able to organize that content in a way that you can make use of it, and ultimately you want to share that with your colleagues. So again, same concept, different application. What we did was we actually co-developed this for about a year or so, and at the end of that year, Jim came to me and said, look, we've been co-developing this, we've integrated a lot of our other products into this, and we've realized that this has really become a really core piece of the FinTech Studio story, meaning if this suddenly just got ripped out and they didn't have this, it would be an issue for them. So at that point, he was saying, what if we acquired the company and brought you on as the CTO? So I'm thinking, okay, that's interesting, because essentially that meant that I was leaving the consumer web browser space and really focusing 100% on the financial services side of this. And so when I was thinking about that, then the question was, do I think this is actually the area where there's higher likelihood for success? Is there a higher likelihood for an exit, and so forth? And ultimately, I thought yes, in the sense that clearly the FinTech Studios team has a really solid background in, again, B2B enterprise sales that not a lot of people have, and is very difficult to get, versus what I was currently working on, which, while it was a really interesting technology and really interesting product, had a much longer and tougher path to monetization, because I don't know anyone that pays for a web browser, right? So, yeah, oops. So ultimately, I realized, okay, this is probably the best path to profitability and really success. So ultimately what we ended up doing was having FinTech Studios acquire iUpple, and I joined on as the CTO for that. So what that actually meant was I basically became programmer number 1 for FinTech Studios. So a glorified programmer with a really nice title, right? But what we did was we continued work on the product, because this was really not the end by any stretch of the imagination. This was really, okay, now we have enough ingredients in the kitchen where we can start building a product that makes sense for this use case. And so I think that's really another area of takeaway, which is you want to be really flexible throughout this journey, right? If I had stuck with this and said, sorry, I don't do enterprise stuff, that's not my wheelhouse, and said no to that, then this entire path would have not happened. Similarly, if FinTech Studios had said, but they're in consumer technology, this is not anywhere close to what we do, I don't want to hear about that, then again, would not have happened. So it's really important that even though it might seem a little bit tangential to what you might think your core doing is, always look at opportunities. At least look at it, give it a chance, because worst case scenario, you look at an opportunity and say, yeah, no, this is what I thought, it's not really what I'm focused on. Or you can look at it and say, wow, okay, on surface, this is not what I expected, but actually I dig into this, there's something here that I can actually use. So why, right? Well, the whole concept of being nimble and being really flexible is one of the key advantages that a small startup or a small company has versus the larger incumbents. So you need to make sure that, regardless of what you're doing, you're leveraging your strengths to your benefit and really trying to use them. And then the whole idea of the whole acquisition piece is, it's much better to have a smaller slice of a big pie than a big slice of an almost non-existent pie. So some people would say, well, when you merged the companies or got acquired, didn't you own a smaller piece of FinTech Studios? Yeah, because I wasn't the sole person in there anymore. But then the idea is, well, would I rather have a smaller piece of a bigger company, or a bigger piece of a very small company with potentially no growth? So in that case, the answer is always keep your mind open to those different things. You never know where it's going to go, and just always keep your eyes open. So FinTech Studios. So that was sort of the end of iUpple and beginning of FinTech Studios, which is continuing now. So FinTech Studios, what we've done, and it's funny, this was, I think, 2 or 3 years ago now. Actually, the code from iUpple, none of that's used today. It's all garbage now. It never got used in the long term. But it was really the process of taking that and, again, finding out what your core competency was. So what we thought was, we want to be a really good container for all these different applications that are really good at data analytics, turned into, data analytics, okay, that makes sense. What if we did data analytics on just a ton of unstructured data from across the internet? Which ultimately turned into what we have today, which is the problem that we're solving is the fact that when you look at Wall Street 10, 15 years ago, the biggest issue was there is not enough information. So everyone's just trying to say, oh, give me that data set, I'll figure out what to do with it later. However, if you fast forward to today, the issue is totally opposite in the sense that there is actually way too much data out there, and no one knows how to make use of it. And majority of that content is actually unstructured, meaning it's things like text or audio or images. So it's very difficult to manage. And so what we do at FinTech Studios is we go across the web to a bunch of different sources, whether it's websites or broker research sources or forums or content that's published specifically to us, around 1 million or so documents each day. And we analyze each of those for things really important to capital markets. So those are things like public companies, private companies, topics, sectors, regions, and essentially analyze the documents for each of these things. And why that's important is because it means that we can very granularly filter and search through these documents. So one use case is legal and regulatory, right? doesn't sound super interesting, but it actually is pretty cool and just really indicative of all the different use cases this sort of approach has. When you look at large firms like these different international banks, for every single global jurisdiction they operate in, they need to make sure they follow every single law to the T, because if they don't, they're getting fined. And if you look at over the past 10 years, across the 10 largest firms on Wall Street, combined, they have received, I want to say, $270 billion of fines, with a B, which is insane. But essentially, they want to make sure they don't keep doing that, because that is not great. So what they need to do is essentially all these different jurisdictions that they're located in, that they have these rules to follow. Each of these jurisdictions have regulators which are constantly, in real time, publishing commentary on those rules or upcoming changes to those rules, or different ways that those rules are going to be interpreted. And so these firms have to make sure that every single time one of these documents come out from these, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 different regulatory bodies, that they get it really quickly. They can identify, does this affect me? And if so, give that to the right person internally to do so. Sounds pretty straightforward, but the way they were doing it before they started using us is they were doing it by hand, meaning they would have hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people manually going to these regulator websites in all these different countries and all these different languages and saying, okay, refresh. Oh, that looks like it affects us. I should probably send that to someone. Extremely, extremely inefficient. And so what we did was we said, great, well, in our world, that's just a couple sources you're tracking, and anytime it hits this filter, you want to be alerted on it. Easy. Set it up once and you're done. But this same concept applies to a lot of different use cases, whether it's credit analysts or even technology, or even other industries, really any industry where it's very data intensive. So you can see this working in legal or pharmaceuticals or corporate, but ultimately a very flexible system. And at this point we've raised, I think, a little over 3 million, something like that. And we're in the process of a Series A, which is going to be 5 to 10 million, depending on how that looks. So we're doing really well. We're about a dozen people right now, about half technology, half sales, marketing, and account support. Have some great clients, and we're really looking forward to seeing how this continues growing, because I think we've really hit a good use case and seems to be getting traction in the market. And so now it's just a matter of continuing to execute on that. So just a quick summary of all the different things we talked about. Really just a focus on some of the little things that I identified along the way that might be helpful, whether it's making sure that it's something you're passionate about. If you're not passionate about it, the second it starts getting tough, you're going to be like, okay, I'm done. This is not fun anymore. But unfortunately, this is one of the things where if you're going to actually go for it, you need to really stick through it. Granted, there is a time where you need to figure out, okay, is this not working, and either pivot or abandon it. But ultimately, you need to make sure that you're going to be extremely perseverant on this, because it's not going to be an easy trip. And the idea of making sure that you're solving something you're familiar with, again, is important, because if you can save your time of being a domain expert in that, it's going to just save you a lot of effort. Knowing when to form a company and when not to, and the timing on that, again, it's going to save you effort and time when you really shouldn't have to spend it there, or if you need to do it, then do it. In terms of fundraising, raising really what you need and not what you want or think you could get, because again, it comes down to the dilution. The more you sell off your company, the less you have, the less say in the company you have, and the less issues you're going to have there. Last is knowing what you're good at and what you're not good at. Really knowing when to buy versus partner versus build, or knowing when to partner with different companies for different services. And then finally, just being flexible. This is not a step 1, step 2, step 3 recipe that you can follow. It's very much a finding things out along the way as you go. So there is no recipe for this per se. So I think these are sort of the core points, and I did leave time at the end for questions. So I figure that should cover that. All right. Yeah.
Would you change anything from freshman year to now?
I mean, probably not, because realistically I learned a bunch, and while I probably didn't learn in the most efficient manner, it drilled down some things to not do again in my head. For example, just figuring out that you should come at it at the business with an idea of how are you going to monetize before you hit 10 million users, right? Things like that you sort of figure out along the way. Or even just as you're building out the product, oh, this feature doesn't work, or I wish I had tried this sooner, that you just identify. But at the end of the day, nothing will teach you more than doing it, and maybe not doing it the most efficient way the first time.
Yeah.
Are your initial friends and family investors now small owners of fintech studios after?
Yeah, exactly. So as part of the acquisition, essentially what's called a stock trade or a stock transfer. So essentially, X amount of shares in iUble are now X amount of shares in fintech studios. So it's good to keep them all updated. They're always happy to hear the different progress of, hey, we just closed a big deal. That's going to help you someday. So they're really happy to see the progress as well. And it's also fun to see that people that just put a little money in it in the beginning, to give them a call hopefully sometime and just say, hey, good news. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
When you first start the company, iUble, for example, for legal work as well as hiring HR and all other marketing side of things, do you all do this by yourself, or do you actually find a partner or friends to help you?
So from the legal and sort of company formation side, I unfortunately did it all myself. That's probably something I would change. Which is, you should probably, it's not that expensive. You can get some out of the box lawyers to just send you the basic templates and say, here, just sign this, and you're done. I was drilling through the Delaware corporate office website, which is not a great read. But yeah, I would say for that, definitely get external help on that. For marketing, I mean, if you can for free, great. If not, I think the more important thing is to focus on building the product, getting that initial feedback from test users and incorporating that back into the product and sort of doing that cycle as many times as you want. Yeah.
Is there a time that is too late to incorporate, that you could just get in trouble for not having done so earlier?
I don't think so.
Besides, if there's a lawsuit against you.
Yeah, at that point it's too late. They already got you. But I'd say, well, first of all, you can't raise capital unless you have a company to sell part of. So that just wouldn't work. But yeah, I mean, it's risk. It's just risk, right? The longer you leave yourself exposed, the riskier it gets.
What about, for example, business plan or burn chart, stuff like that? When you are having your browser, when you are building it, other than you have your passion that you want to build something, have you considered the profitability side of it when you are forming the company, rather than just legally protecting yourself?
Yeah, for sure. And my initial thought was, oh, easy, I'll just sell ads. Right, and so I started looking at the Google AdWords prices, and I'm like, okay, if I get X amount of users and charge X price per ad, and I'm starting to see, ooh, that's a lot of money. You forget that no one wants to give you advertisements until you have a sort of critical capacity. Okay. So things you sort of figure out along the way. Yeah.
Do you know how much to pay someone who's working for you, and also if someone already has something that you're looking for that you want to incorporate in your project, and how much would you think about paying?
Sure. So that's tough, right? Because if you're starting off early, you clearly don't have a ton of money. So that's always a factor. One factor is maybe you say, I'm going to pay you minimum wage or $20 an hour, but I'll give you a little bit of equity to sort of make up for that. So it really comes down to what the skill you're trying to do is. For example, if you just need a basic programmer, that's not providing any other value than that. You don't have to pay too much. But again, especially when you're very early on and cash strapped, really you only have the equity to work with until you get money. So if you can get someone then that's buying into it, maybe then the idea is, I'm not hiring you sort of on a one-off basis to just do this job, but maybe they want to be a co-founder, right? Because then they're going to be invested more and sort of help you out there.
Yeah. Did you ever get into outsourcing work or no?
Yes. Yes, it's interesting. It's tough because on paper you just say, oh, I'm just going to hire a dozen people out of Belarus. It'll be easy. And it's not. We actually have a couple people fintech studios that are out of Belarus that we manage. And it takes time, for sure, because you have to be very strict about the code quality. Because if you just start letting random people submit code to your code repository, it's going to look like garbage real quick. You need to make sure that you essentially train them to some point. And then, yes, they are cheaper on paper, but when you actually factor in all the management and sort of oversight that comes with that, it's more expensive than you'd think. But in some cases it does work, because back to my sort of comment on how you manage your cash flow and making sure your burn rate is manageable, if you need to say, sorry, Mr. Outsource guy, but we don't want to hire you anymore, you can just say, I'm not renewing this contract. Versus actually hiring somebody, then you actually have to fire them. That's not fun. Nobody likes that. So it does have its uses. Yeah.
One more question is more regarding you personally. When you graduate, of course you're already in a company setting, but have you considered, well, hopefully not, if the venture failed or things didn't work out as you like, do you continue want to go through the path of software engineering, or you want to like do something else?
So when I actually got the acquisition offer from FinTech Studios, it was February my senior year. So I was like, okay, we're starting to cut this close, because obviously we're not making money at iApple. So basically, I was starting to get faced with the decision of, okay, do I take a part-time job to support this? Do I, what do you do? So I was fortunate in that sense, in that at least with that I have more stability. But ultimately you're working for very, very cheap in the beginning until you start getting some traction. Then as the company grows, then you can actually take a real person's salary, which is nice. But yeah, I mean, for those months between the acquisition and actually graduating, and even before that, there wasn't much schoolwork involved. My priorities were a little bit backwards. Well, not backwards, depending on who you ask.
Right.
But that's always tough, right? It's making sure, I got a project due or I have a deliverable for a client, which is going to pay money. I leaned toward the deliverable for the client. But yeah, things like that.
Great, Kevin. And Kevin's also an example of why, if you're interested in entrepreneurship and if you have a business idea, start sooner than later. Because while you're still in school, you have a couple of years of hopefully traction where you can build up your business. And when you graduate, maybe you'll be CTO someplace. Your business will be acquired. And so, right, it pays to get started early. Because if you start after you graduate, you have your student loans, you have to start paying your own rent. You don't really have the luxury then to start a business, right?
There's really no better time, because you have so much free time, right? No, somewhat free time. But you don't really have any responsibilities, in the sense that you don't have a mortgage to pay, you don't have kids to feed. So if you're going to do it, probably now is the best time. Not to say you can't do it later, but it's much, much tougher when you're already sort of used to a lifestyle to say, well, this salary was nice, but I'd rather take nothing to try to start a new company.
Great presentation, wasn't it? Thank you so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.